This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. We're going to talk about how continuing racial inequality in America is in part a result of 20th century policies that mandated housing segregation, including in the North. My guest, Richard Rothstein, is the author of the new book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. He writes about federal, state, and local policies that help explain why new suburbs were predominantly white, while housing projects became predominantly black, and so many neighborhoods became and remain segregated. He also writes about how this mandated segregation has contributed to inequality in education, employment, and income. Rothstein is a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Richard Rothstein, welcome back to Fresh Air.
Thank you very much.
Your work is really about how housing segregation isn't something that accidentally happened. It was policy, even in the North. I think, as you point out in your book, Americans assume that segregation is a result of prejudice and white flight, bank redlining, income difference, self-segregation. How far do government policies in the North date back, separating white and black neighborhoods?
The federal policies mostly began during the New Deal. It was a state-sponsored system of segregation. The things you've just mentioned, private prejudice and real estate steering and bank redlining and income differences, all certainly played a role. But without federal policy designed explicitly with racial explicit intent to segregate every metropolitan area in this country, those private factors would not have been able to successfully segregate their communities.
So what are the policies in the New Deal that segregated housing?
Well, there were two main policies in the New Deal. Immediately after Roosevelt took office in 1933, the Public Works Administration began to build the first civilian public housing in the country. And this was a time when there was an enormous housing shortage in the country. No construction was being done in the Depression. Many families were homeless. The Public Works Administration program in housing was primarily designed to provide housing to white, middle-class, lower middle-class families. The progressive aspect of it was that some projects were built for African Americans as well, but it was explicitly segregated, and in many cases, it segregated neighborhoods that had never known segregation before. So this went on throughout the country.
What was the rationalization for that?
Well, I think this is a difficult question to answer. I don't think anybody knows, and I describe in my book that certainly the Roosevelt administration was staffed with people who had racial assumptions that we would consider unacceptable today. It was not a liberal administration in these ways, except for the fact that it built some projects for African Americans, and that was very progressive. African Americans had gotten no federal help before the New Deal. The help they got was segregated, but and it was done throughout the country. There's some people who think that the federal government did this in order to gain Southern support for its economic programs. That's certainly part of the motivation, but Southerners never objected to integration in the North. They only wanted to make sure that they could preserve segregation in the South. We know that the Roosevelt administration was very prejudiced in other ways. We know that it refused to accept refugees from Nazi Germany, and there were many people who lost their lives as a result. So the fact that it was focused on preserving the racial hierarchy in this country is not surprising.
So what was the second Roosevelt administration New Deal era program that created or enforced housing segregation?
The second major one was the Federal Housing Administration, which was established in 1934, the year after the Public Works Administration. And the Federal Housing Administration is well known today by many people as an agency that would not insure mortgages for African Americans at redline communities. That was a minor part of what the federal government, what the FHA did in order to segregate metropolitan areas. The most important role of the Federal Housing Administration was it subsidized mass production builders of entire subdivisions, entire suburbs. And it did so with a requirement that no homes be sold to African Americans, and that every home in these subdivisions had a clause in the deed that prohibited resale to African Americans. So these two programs combined worked to segregate metropolitan areas in a way that they otherwise would not have been segregated. The public housing program separated African Americans from integrated neighborhoods. The Federal Housing Administration then subsidized white families to move out of urban areas into suburbs, all white suburbs, where African Americans were prohibited from following.
And in what sense were African Americans prohibited from following whites into the suburbs?
They were prohibited because the developers of these suburbs got bank loans on condition that they sell no homes to African Americans. It was a federal requirement that they get these bank loans only on condition that they not sell to African Americans. And the Federal Housing Administration required that deeds in these homes have what we now refer to as restrictive covenants, prohibitions on resale to African Americans. This was not an implicit program. It was not something that was hidden in any way. It was written out in the Federal Housing Administration's manuals that they gave to underwriters who were appraising properties for possible mortgage insurance. The involvement of the Federal Housing Administration in the development of these suburbs was very open, explicit, and well known. There was nothing secret about it.
So what was the Federal Housing Authority's justification for excluding African Americans from buying homes in newly built suburbs?
The Federal Housing Administration's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in these suburbs, or even if they bought homes near these suburbs, the property values of the homes that they were insuring, the white homes that they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. There was no basis for this claim on the part of the Federal Housing Administration. In fact, when African Americans tried to buy homes in all white neighborhoods or in mostly white neighborhoods, property values rose because African Americans were more willing to pay more for properties than whites were, simply because their housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. So the rationale that the Federal Housing Administration used was never based on any kind of study. It was never based on any reality. Studies showed that property values, as I said, increased when African Americans moved into white neighborhoods. But nonetheless, the Federal Housing Administration maintained this rationale for 30 or 40 years.
It seems that the things that you're describing that were so restrictive and discriminatory against African Americans would be unconstitutional. Was it tested in the courts?
It was tested in the courts, and the courts mistakenly, erroneously, did not stop them. In 1926, the Supreme Court said that it was not a violation of the Constitution to circulate these restrictive covenants that prohibited sales of homes to African Americans. In 1948, the Supreme Court reversed itself and said that, well, it is unconstitutional to evict African Americans who move into homes in violation of these agreements. But the fact that it took the Supreme Court until 1948 to recognize that it was unconstitutional to enforce these covenants didn't mean that it was constitutional before then, any more than in 1954 when the Supreme Court ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional. That didn't mean that it was constitutional before 1954. It meant that the Supreme Court recognized its error in calling it constitutional before that.
So it's really kind of funny in a way that 1948 Supreme Court decision that you mentioned, Shelley versus Kramer, that banned court-enforced restrictive covenants, that was a unanimous 6-0 decision. 3 of the 9 justices had to recuse themselves from participating in this decision because they had racial restrictions covering their homes.
Well, we assume that's the case. They did recuse themselves. Justices don't tell the reason that they recuse themselves, but
this is just an assumption that you're making.
Well, historians generally agree that the reason that the justices recused themselves was because they themselves had restrictive covenants on their homes.
That's pretty interesting. So in looking at these federal restrictions that we've been talking about, you would argue that this shows that the federal government did some social engineering in creating segregation in the North.
Well, more than some social engineering, the entire northern metropolitan areas across the country are largely segregated because of these two programs. New York City, 85% of the subdivisions, the large subdivisions that were built in the New York City metropolitan area in the 1930s and 40s had FHA required restrictive covenants on them. So this was more than just a contribution. It was structuring the entire private market.
Let's look at the GI Bill. We talked about this a little bit the last time you were on the show, but the GI Bill gave benefits to veterans